I'm Tracy Sabol. Tonight on EWTN News Nightly, important announcement. Pope Francis names 21 new cardinals to be installed in September. We have a report from Rome. High-stakes trip. President Biden is in England ahead of tomorrow's NATO summit. Outreach to China. The Treasury Secretary returns from Beijing. We have analysis of her trip from Gordon Chang. And that's amazing. A reminder from the Holy Father on the presence of miracles in our daily lives. These stories and more tonight.
From EWTN, the Global Catholic Network, this is EWTN News Nightly.
Thanks for being with us. Our top story tonight, Pope Francis has named 21 new cardinals to be installed at the Vatican at the end of September. Since his election back in 2013, Pope Francis has created 121 cardinals from 66 countries. EWTN Vatican correspondent Colin Flynn has more.
A very good evening, Tracy, and good to see you back. Well, there has been a lot happening here in Rome in terms of important church announcements in just the last few days. So let's start with the latest news. Yesterday, Pope Francis came to the window overlooking St. Peter's Square and announced that he would be creating 21 new cardinals at the end of September. Now, with this latest announcement, it means that Pope Francis will have personally chosen 73% of the cardinals who will vote for his successor. Why is this important? Well, it increases the odds that the next pope will be someone who will share Pope Francis's vision for the future of the Church. Many of the new cardinals are from countries like Colombia, South Sudan and Tanzania, again increasing the odds of a future pope hailing from the Southern Hemisphere. Some of the names include Bishop Stephen Chow Sai-yong of Hong Kong, Latin Patriarch Pizzaballa of Jerusalem, and Archbishop Victor Manuel Fernandez. Now, that last name I mentioned, Archbishop Victor Manuel Fernandez, this has been his second big promotion in just the last number of days. Last week, he was appointed as the prefect for the Dicastery of the Doctrine of the Faith, one of the Church's most powerful and important governing bodies. The other big news, Tracy, coming out of the Vatican is Friday's release of the list of names of those who will be taking part in the upcoming Synod on Synodality this October. Pope Francis announced that there would be 364 voting members, including 54 women. At the Vatican's press conference about the Synod, EWTN spoke to Sister Natalie Beckard, the Undersecretary of the General Secretary of the Synod of Bishops, who told us that both the Synod and the upcoming World Youth Day in Lisbon are connected.
So there is a deep connection, we can say, between synodality and youth ministry. Even Pope Francis in Christus Vivit has stated youth ministry must be missionary, popular and synodal. And so there can't be synodality without young people, and we can say there can't be the evangelization of the youth and the proclamation of the gospel to the youth without a synodal style.
Well, there has been a lot of analysis over the names of those chosen by the Holy Father to lead and facilitate the Synod, many thought to be controversial, but notably included are German Cardinal Muller and, chosen by the U.S. Bishops' Conference, names like Cardinal Dolan and 5 others known for their defense of religious liberty, pro-life protections, immigration and the sacraments. In Rome, Colin Flynn for EWTN News Nightly.
And for more on the story, including a look at all the 21 cardinals-elect, visit our partners at CatholicNewsAgency.com. Well, just hours from now, President Joe Biden and his NATO counterparts hold a summit in Lithuania's capital. The ongoing war in Ukraine will top that agenda. Leaders are set to endorse new defense plans in case Russian President Vladimir Putin tries to broaden Moscow's war beyond Ukraine. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reports. Owen?
That's right, Tracy. The NATO summit is all about keeping the support for Ukraine going and to increase the pressure on Moscow. But first, before the NATO meeting starts tomorrow, today President Joe Biden met with the UK Prime Minister as well as King Charles III.
President Joe Biden meets with British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak at the Prime Minister's residence in London.
Couldn't be meeting with a closer friend and a greater ally. And We've got a lot to talk about.
That includes Ukraine and the U.S. deciding to give them controversial cluster munitions, which are bombs, as seen in this training video, that open in the air and release scores of smaller bomblets. The bombs or duds can kill civilians long after the war is over. In an earlier interview, President Biden said Ukraine continues to be brutally attacked across the board by cluster munitions.
And it was a very difficult decision on my part. And by the way, I discussed this with our allies, discussed this with our friends up on the Hill.
Sunak, for his part, has distanced himself from the U.S. decision. The Prime Minister's spokesman said the leader spoke about Britain's opposition to the use of cluster munitions. In fact, more than two-thirds of NATO members have barred cluster munitions for their potential threat to civilian life. One Democratic U.S. lawmaker on Sunday said cluster bombs should never be used.
We know what takes place in terms of cluster bombs being very dangerous to civilians. They don't always immediately explode. Children can step on them. That's a line we should not cross.
President Biden also met today with King Charles III, seen together here inspecting an honor guard. And in their first meeting in their respective roles, the two men discussing climate change as they prod private companies to do more to bolster clean energy in developing countries.
Now, back to those cluster bombs for a moment. For its part, the Catholic Church has long condemned the use of cluster munitions. In fact, in a 2017 address calling for nuclear disarmament, Pope Francis praised the ban on cluster bombs. At the White House, Owen Jensen, EWTN News Nightly.
U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen wrapped up her three-day trip to China. And while in the communist country, she said the U.S. will listen to Beijing's complaints about security-related curbs on technology exports. Secretary Yellen also defended White House measures on trade with China. During her visit, China sent more than a dozen military planes and warships into airspace and water around Taiwan. We go now to Gordon Chang, author of The Great U.S. China Tech War and the Upcoming Collapse of China. Gordon, great to see you as always. A lot to get to. But first, I want to get your thoughts on Secretary Yellen's trip to Beijing. How do you think it went? And what do you make of these continued outreach from the White House to China?
Yeah, this is really wrong policy on our part. It's China engaged in dangerous and provocative activities against the U.S. It should be the Chinese trying to mend relations, not us. And we have sent one high-level emissary to Beijing after another, especially with Janet Yellen bowing 3 times to a subordinate official. The Chinese are starting to think that we're vassals and that we're acknowledging our subordinate status to the Grand Chinese Court. So I think China is going to become much more belligerent going forward. And this is really taking us in a direction we don't want to go.
Yeah, and Gordon, as we mentioned during Secretary Yellen's visit, Beijing actually sent warships and fighter jets to Taiwan. Tell us more about this.
Yeah, China is continuing to pressure Taiwan. They do that with warships. They do that with planes, sometimes circling the island. And really, this is an attempt to intimidate everybody into submission. But also at the same time, China has sent vessels over to Reed Bank in the South China Sea, which is part of the Philippines, and they're trying to take that away from Manila. So really what we're seeing is not only the pressure in Taiwan, but also farther south. And this really means that China's on the warpath right now. It wants to pick a fight, and the United States needs to make it clear that we will defend our friends and allies. And the problem is, by talking nice in Beijing, we're basically eroding deterrence.
How concerning is this, Gordon? I mean, what do you think we should do?
Well, I think the United States needs to make it very clear, both in public and in private, that the United States will defend Taiwan. We will defend the Philippines, which we have a mutual defense treaty. We need to start pre-positioning supplies in Taiwan and other places in the region, something we didn't do by and large with regard to Ukraine, and we saw what happened there. This is a time where I think it's gone beyond words, where we have to take actions because China is rapidly preparing to go to war. And it's not just its military. On the day that Yellen arrived, by the way, Xi Jinping was talking to the Eastern Theater Command, giving one of his let's go to war speeches. And the Eastern Theater Command is the one that would invade Taiwan. But we also see China mobilizing its civilians for war. They're doing a number of other things in preparation for going into battle. This looks exceedingly dangerous.
Something else that I want to talk about, this new economic data that came out of China showing that producer prices dropped 5.4% year over year. What is a signal, Gordon, and how troubling is it?
Yeah, for China, this is another sign that its export sector is in distress, as is manufacturing as a whole. But it's the entire Chinese economy, Tracy. China needs a serious structural reform. It can't do it because, as a political matter, because that would cause too much pain. The Chinese economy is on a one-way trip down. They can hold things together because they've got strong currency controls, but we're starting to see that the Chinese people are giving up on their society. And that's most evident with the surge in Chinese migrants coming across our southern border, who are not the poor, by the way. They're middle-class Chinese because they can afford to pay $35,000 a head to the cartels in Mexico. So we see China basically at a point where the whole thing could melt away quite fast.
Yeah, and we're so intertwined right now, Gordon. What kind of impact would that have on the U.S.?
Well, first of all, there would be panic in global markets because Wall Street is not willing to acknowledge how serious the situation is in China. So they will be taken by surprise. And I think we're going to find that we're going to be scrambling for a number of products because our companies, although they're starting to become concerned about resilience, are not moving their supply chains out of China fast enough. And that's part because of corporate inaction, but it's also because there's no leadership on the part of the Biden administration to really push companies out of China, which is what we really need to do right now. Yes, that's going to be risky and dangerous, but we're at a point where everything is risky and dangerous.
We have about 30 seconds left or so, Gordon. Curious, what else is on your radar?
Well, at this particular time, I'm worried about the relationship between China and Russia. China is continuing to support the regime in Moscow with regard to the war in Ukraine. The Biden administration is, telling China not to do it, but China keeps on doing it. And so the Chinese see our warnings as hollow. And that never leads to a good result, especially as we saw in the 1930s.
We're going to leave it right there. Gordon, always great to be with you and get your insights. We appreciate it. Meanwhile, President Joe Biden continues to trumpet Bidenomics, a term for his administration's efforts to help improve the financial situation for American families. But according to a recent poll, less than 40% of Americans approve of the president's handling of the economy. And several experts in the nation's capital say the Bidenomics falls short. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales joins us now with more. Eric.
Well, good evening, Trace. Ever since President Biden announced his Bidenomics plan, economists have been weighing in, and many say that the problem lies not only with the president's rhetoric, but also his policies and economic reality. Evidence points to many Americans continuing to struggle, living paycheck to paycheck. The president continues to say that the economy is getting strong and getting better.
Investment is working, and factories being built, and jobs being created, happening in rural America, the heartland, all across America, in communities that have been left out and hollowed out. This is what it looks like across the country.
But Joel Griffith, the research fellow at the Heritage Foundation, says not so fast.
One of the centerpieces of the Biden package has been so-called infrastructure. But this is not typical infrastructure that we think of with better roads or better bridges. The bulk of all of these hundreds of billions of dollars worth of infrastructure spending is going to further the Green New Deal.
Griffith says the typical American family is already struggling with inflation, including high energy costs. Energy and Commerce Committee member Congressman Bob Latta tells me the president's priorities are not in line with what the average American wants.
When the president talks about this, when you spend a lot of money and you don't pay for it, it's a problem. And but we got issues in this country that I'm very, very fearful of with what's going to hit us in a very short period of time.
Especially with Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell echoing the U.S. remains a long way from low and stable inflation.
Inflation pressures continue to run high, and the process of getting inflation back down to 2% has a long way to go.
Democrats continue to defend the president's plan. Pennsylvania Congressman Dwight Evans tweeted, quote, "Bidenomics is working. I'm proud to have voted for major parts of the Biden-Harris economic agenda, including the infrastructure law, the American Rescue Plan, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act." The Biden administration continues to tout strong jobs market, but saying unemployment is down now. But researchers like Joel Griffith tell me that once someone stops looking for work, they are no longer counted as unemployed. And close to 1 million people have dropped out of the labor market. At the Capitol, Eric Rosales, EWTN News Nightly.
And we have a lot more still to come here on EWTN News Nightly, including Fight for the Unborn. Lawmakers in Iowa are set to discuss a pro-life proposal and analysis of a new social media app and why it's causing some controversy. Legislature begins a special session tomorrow with hopes of passing a new pro-life bill. The session was called by Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds. The proposal aims to ban abortion after 6 weeks. The current draft would include a handful of exceptions. Currently, Iowa allows abortions up to 20 weeks of pregnancy. A federal court says that Tennessee's new law banning so-called gender-affirming care can go into effect. The ruling says that issues like transgender health care are better left to lawmakers. This comes after a district court had blocked large parts of the law from taking effect. And in Kansas, a judge has ruled that on a driver's license, the only options for gender are male and female. Several hundred transgender people had changed their permits so that the sex listing matched their so-called gender identity. Opponents say the ruling will cause immediate harm to the transgender community. And joining us now is Julie Gunlock, director of the Independent Women's Forum's Center for Progress and Innovation. Julie, thanks for coming on. Always so good to see you. A lot to chat about today, including this news out of Kansas regarding those who identify as transgender no longer being allowed to change their sex on their driver's license. I want to get your thoughts on that.
It is very important that official documents like driver's license, birth certificate, all of these things that are used to identify you show your actual biological sex. We have seen men increasingly enter women's spaces, whether that's domestic violence shelters, women's prisons, and it puts women at unique danger because we know biological men are stronger than women. And so it's really important that when we're deciding where individuals belong, what shelter they belong in, what prison they belong in, we know their biological sex. People can deny that there's a difference between the sexes, but that's not true. And I'm glad to see that they're going back to this binary choice. Sex is binary. There can be a million different genders, but we need this for the safety of women's spaces.
Yeah, and that's a good point to make. A lot of controversy over this new Miss Netherlands who was crowned over the weekend because that beauty queen is actually a biological male and the first transgender woman to win the title of Miss Netherlands. Julie, your take on this?
This is a perfect segue because it's the same thing. It's men getting into women's spaces. But you know, these contests are no longer about beauty, composure, grace, your ability to speak on important political issues or world affairs. These contests are increasingly becoming about intersectionality. How many intersections do you tick off? And virtue signaling. This is unfortunate because, again, this is a biological male taking scholarships and awards from women. It's the same thing. Women's spaces are really being taken over increasingly by men who identify as women.
Yeah, also making headlines. Meta, as you know, launched its Threads app last week to compete with Twitter. And it seems already that people are saying that certain voices are being silenced, such as conservatives and those who question gender ideology. Julie, what more do you know about this? And does this surprise you?
This isn't a surprise at all. Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook and Meta, whatever you want to call it, they have a long track record of quashing conservative speech and deplatforming conservatives. We've already seen this happen with Libs of TikTok. This is one of the biggest accounts on Twitter that Libs of TikTok doesn't do anything but expose what the left wants to do. And many of the people on the left who are transgender activists are targeting kids. So Libs of TikTok has experienced trouble on this new platform. And again, it's not a surprise. Zuckerberg has been involved in politics. We know what he did during the 2020 election, spending $400 million, largely through leftist nonprofits, to engage and really sway that election. So we know that he is a political person, and I'm not at all surprised that he's again trying to quash conservative speech on this new platform.
Julie, I want to switch gears. A disturbing incident took place at a Catholic church in Brooklyn, New York, just a few days ago, where someone spray painted black spray paint all over a statue of Our Blessed Mother. Now, fortunately, that person was found and charged with criminal mischief as a hate crime. That said, what do you think is fueling all of this? And what do you think we as Catholics, how do you think we should respond?
This is a breakdown of civil society. We've been seeing this in a lot of urban areas in this country. We saw the footage just yesterday. It was absolutely terrible of a young man on a moped shooting at people. He killed an 87-year-old man and injured 3 others. And this kind of vandalism that we're seeing at churches, particularly Catholic churches, again, it's a breakdown in civil society, but it also reflects that Americans aren't as religious and don't have the sort of respect for religious institutions as as Americans once did. So it's a very disturbing thing that we're seeing. And as for how Catholics can respond, we need to pray. We really need to pray for these people, these disturbed people doing such awful things. We need to pray for our church and our Pope and the church's leadership. And go to church, support your local church.
Yeah, we have about a minute left or so, Julie. But, as we heard from Owen earlier, President Joe Biden met with King Charles III and the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak earlier today ahead of the upcoming NATO summit in Lithuania tomorrow. What do you make of President Biden's stopover in London, and how productive do you think those meetings were?
I'm not sure how productive they were, but I will say the stopover in London is clearly an effort to sort of soothe over the ruffled feathers of those who are still against the use of cluster bombs. Now, the cluster bombs that we use in the United States and are going to give to Ukraine are much better. They do not leave as many unexploded sort of ammunition on the ground. What Russia is using is much less sort of intelligent weapon, but it still is interesting to see the Biden administration switch on this issue so quickly. And so I think the British are very much against these cluster bombs. And so again, an effort to shore up the alliance between the two countries.
And we're going to leave right there, Julie. Always great to be with you. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you.
Up next on EWTN News Nightly, the future of higher education, what the U.S. bishops are saying about a recent Supreme Court ruling, plus why Pope Francis says we should never lose our sense of amazement. Well, at least one person is dead as heavy rains bring flooding and evacuations to the northeastern U.S. In Putnam, New York, a flash flood caused damage and left cars in danger. And in Vermont, the governor there declared a state of emergency. Meanwhile, Boston's Logan Airport reported more than 200 flight cancellations due to the extreme weather. All the U.S. bishops are reaffirming the importance of education access for everyone. This after the Supreme Court recently ruled against affirmative action in higher education. In a statement late last week, the head of the USCCB's ad hoc committee against racism said in part, quote, "It is our hope that our Catholic institutions of higher learning will continue to find ways to make education possible and affordable for everyone, regardless of their background." Republican Congressman Chris Smith of New Jersey has renewed his request to visit imprisoned Bishop Rolando Alvarez in Nicaragua. Representative Smith, who is Catholic, first requested the meeting last month. Reports surfaced last week that the bishop was released from prison, but was sent back after refusing to leave the country. Congressman Smith said that he is very concerned about the safety and well-being of the bishop. He is also demanding an end to the Ortega regime's persecution of the Catholic Church. And finally tonight, Pope Francis asked the faithful if we allow ourselves to be amazed by the works of God.
Con dolore ho appreso che nuovamente è stato versato sangue in Terra Santa.
In a Sunday address to pilgrims at the Vatican, the Holy Father said that our lives are filled with miracles. Pope Francis also said that we should allow ourselves to be impressed with God's work as if we are children and to thank Him each day for the gifts He gives us. And we thank you for watching tonight. Remember, you can follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at EWTN News Nightly. I'm Tracy Sabol. Good night and God bless.